Grace, peace, and mercy all. I just finished our first Bible study entitled Our Suffering. And the first session, session one, is an introduction followed by some talk about grief. So for the introduction, the first week, this session, we're talking about grief. And it's mainly going to be a pastoral kind of thing. We're not going to be focusing so much on scripture, but much more on people's feelings and experiences and, sort of common ways of looking at grief. The second week, we're going to be looking at lament. And particularly, we're going to look at, in the Bible, the book of Lamentations and examples of lament. Then we're going to look next at wisdom, the third week. So third session, we'll look at wisdom, particularly wisdom literature, what the book of Proverbs, as well as the books of Job and Ecclesiastes have to say about suffering. Then the fourth week, we're going to look at compassion and codependency. These are potentially two sides of a single coin, right? So on one hand, you have suffering with compassion. That's when, you take it in the original language and squish it together and such. Compassion, suffering with. On the other hand, you have codependency, which is in some ways suffering with as well, but suffering with in an unhealthy manner. Then finally, the fifth week, we're going to stick it all together, hopefully, and ask the big question. Where is God in all of this? So, what I'd like you to do for a few seconds is stop and consider the question, what are you most excited for? Now, from here, we're going to go to a stress sidebar. So, not part of the main conversation, but the side of it. If I was doing an academic paper, I'd call it an excursus. So, there's something called the Social Readjustment Scale. And it talks about stressors as having point numbers connected to them. I was going to say price points, but that's not quite what's going on, although that might be a metaphor for it as well. But so it is the idea that different stressors have different numerical values. So, for example, the death of a spouse is a 100-point stressor. A mortgage over $40,000 is a 31-point stressor. Change in church activities, which you watching this is an example of that, is an 18-point stressor. So, why does this matter? When you add up all the stress, if you end up with a number over 350, you're in a danger zone of stress. So your physical, mental, and emotional well-being might go off kilter in one way or another because of the level of stress that you're experiencing. So, the reason I wanted to bring this up with the group and now with all of you is that as it stands, all the changes that are happening on account of the pandemic, we're already at 306 on the stress scale. And in fact, if we have kids with us, we're at 335. So this is, 44 or 20-something, I think, or 15-something stress points away from being in the danger zone where you're going to have mental, emotional, or physical reactions to the stress that you're experiencing. So, question I have for you all, take a few moments to consider how stressed are you and what are those stressors for you right now? Now, moving on to the next portion, what is grief? The title of this book makes it plain. A natural response to loss. A natural response to loss. So grief is all about responses to loss. These can be large losses or small losses. In fact, we can, even when you have a good change in your life, there are still things that you lose because of that change. And even that can be something you grieve, that you have these responses to. Now, there are on one hand primary losses, but then there's also secondary losses. So a primary loss might be that you change jobs or you lose a job. Now that's a big loss and change. But then also there's secondary issues such as you can't go to the same water cooler to talk with your buddies about Game of Thrones or whatever particular thing is going around on the water cooler at that point. That you have that change. It's not a primary loss, but it's a consequence of the initial loss. For that matter, we have the question: what was your first experience of loss? Okay, now we're going to move on to the next section, which is some issues that we can have when we talk about grief. The first one is that there's certain Christian piety out there that says if you really believed in the resurrection, you wouldn't be grieving. You wouldn't have the sads right now. Poppycock. That is simply not the way grief and loss works. Now, we're going to look very briefly. Look, I have a phone that has a Bible app on it. So, if we look at John chapter 11, verses 32 through 35. So, Jesus has just showed up after Lazarus dying. Now, when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. Now, the interesting thing, so first off, Jesus is weeping. Jesus is having a grief response. So if somebody gives you that Christian kind of happiness stuff, telling you that you can't be feeling the sads right now, say Jesus felt the sads. And it's because he's fully human and fully divine. And if it's true that he's fully human, guess what? He's going to have a grief response. In fact, he has a couple. Look, in fact, there's a couple different grief response going on in this piece of scripture. You have Mary falling, right? That she's so physically overcome when seeing Jesus, who she sees could have possibly changed and shaped the loss she had, that she plunks down. And she weeps. The people around her weep. Jesus is troubled. His guts are moved. So he has an emotional reaction. Then he also cries. He has a physical reaction to this loss of Lazarus. So all that just to think a bit about the pieties we sometimes trot out as if they were truth instead of an attempt to stop somebody from feeling stuff that they're feeling. Okay. Another piety that's kind of out there that can be dangerous is the idea that time heals all wounds. In point of fact, time is neutral-ish. So on one hand, there are ways in which time can soothe different aspects of grief, that losses become less acute the further you get away. On the other hand, you can take that to mean you don't need to do anything, you don't need to process your grief, you don't need to think about you being sad. And that's not the case. In fact, the metaphor I'd like to use is, say you have a 500-pound ice cube stuck on the bottom half of your body. Now, time will fix that, right? Eventually it'll melt. On the other hand, it's kind of an unpleasant thing to do to yourself, to be stuck under an ice cube until it melts, which could take days. So, time is neutral-ish. In fact, going for a passive kind of thing can leave you stuck in patterns that will end up becoming unhealthy if you allow them to fester. If you don't move into your grief, you will stay in a state of disbelief or denial, right? It's not just a river in Egypt. So, next thing to talk about that can be a little dangerous is the so-called stages of grief. This is Kubler-Ross' way of understanding what you have to do to get from point A to point B, from loss to a semblance of health. Now, the stages of grief, this is something we've been talking about for 50 years. It's entered into not only culture writ large, but popular culture, cinema, all kinds of spaces. In fact, one of the things that sometimes cinematographers like to do is shoot the same scene, but using each one of those different stages of grief to see what it looks like. So what does this scene look like if you're in the denial stage? What does this scene look like if you're angry? What does the scene look like if you're bargaining? What if you're depressed? What if you're in the acceptance stage? That's a way to both, sort of hone your acting skills or your directing skills. And so it's entered into popular culture in a big way. The problem is, it is not a perfect, no system is perfect, and it's definitely not a perfect way to think about grief. Because quite frankly, grief isn't linear. People are unique. They're going to maybe return back to different stages. They might not experience the stages in the same order. And in fact, the stages will wash over you in different ways. One of the things that one of the people that was at Bible study pointed out that I think was brilliant, and I'd not really thought of other than bringing up the point about secondary losses. But our losses are multitudes, even when it's theoretically one thing. So you might be on stage one of grief. You might be, stuck at denial of one thing, but another aspect of it, you're already depressed. So, you might be, you've got over the fact that, oh yeah, in fact, I'm stuck in the house and I'm angry about it. But you're still denying that means you have to wear a mask, right? Or alternatively, you're really sad about not being able to go into the office or something like that. So there's different ways to, different spaces you're in with different aspects of a loss. So you're grieving in different ways for different things. For that matter, though, I do want to give the stages of grief their due. The best thing they did for all of us in the last 50 years is they've helped us name emotions that we feel. They've helped us name our feelings when we're grieving. Because there's a lot of people who, when they're in the midst of a feeling, they don't realize that they're feeling it. So when they at least have something to tack their experiences to, that's really helpful. Oh yeah, no, I'm being angry right now. That's not a bad thing to know that I'm doing, because that way I at least know that I'm being jerked to people, or whatever the thing would be. Being able to name your emotions is an amazing, wonderful thing. But tacking all your emotions to a particular order of going through and assuming you're doing it wrong if you're not feeling the emotions in the right order or something, not so good. So here are two alternative ways to think about grief, these stages. One of them is thinking about it in waves, that grief ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's bigger splashes, sometimes it's little and gentle, almost brook-like emotional and physical responses to grief. So, the things that you usually go through, if you're thinking about it as a wave, is you start off with shock and denial, which fits pretty nicely into denial and anger, right? Then from there you go to despair and disorganization, and then finally reorganization and then accommodation. And yet these will come sometimes, you might have a really big despair swoosh coming at you, and you might have a very small shock. It might not have been surprising that so-and-so died. You expected that. But you didn't expect the way you despair about it. And for that matter, when you return to some new normal, you didn't realize that it was going to be so surprising and shocking. Anyway, so waves is one way to think about the stages of grief. Another one is that it can be cyclical. So you can start off in loss and then move to protest, then despair, then detachment, and then you recover and you move on through it. Or that particular cycle, you might not get through the whole thing, or you might have a different aspect of your grief that doesn't get through that thing. So you start out at loss, you go to protest, you go to despair, you go to detachment, then you go back to protest and despair and detachment. So you might go around the circle a couple times, but it's important to keep moving on that circle. Not that you need to move in a rapid way. In fact, that probably encourages you to stay in a cycle kind of thing longer than hitting a recovery. But if you get stuck in any one of those things, it can become pathological. So, for example, if you get stuck in the protest mode of things, you're going to become a rage monster. For that matter, if you're stuck in the despair aspect of grief, you're going to be a really sad sack for a while. You might become clinically depressed. For that matter, if you get in the detached end of things, you can become vaguely sociopathic or so there's different stages there, and you want to kind of keep moving at a healthy pace. And if you get stuck in any one of those for too long, you want to seek professional help. So a question to think about here is, how do you respond to loss? How did you respond to loss as a child? And what is your family pattern when confronted with loss? Then finally, the last way to think about grief that I'm going to leave you all with is the tasks of grief. So instead of just being kind of a passive person experiencing these things, that there are particular things that you're trying to do in order to move on to the next stage, to eventually get to a new equilibrium that is healthy. So the first step is accepting the reality of loss. So recognizing, in fact, you're stuck in the house, for example. That's one example of, again, a small loss. But you have to recognize that you really are here in your home office, not your church office, or some, again, very small loss, but an example that is literally right in front of you right now. So, and part of this is your coping mechanisms have to fall away. So you can't deny that you're in the loss. You have to get to a point where you can be in a healthy way, move beyond your coping mechanisms to face the particular loss you're experiencing. Then the second part is experiencing and processing the pain of grief. To put it simply, in order to grieve, you need to grieve. And a quick note as we're in this pandemic. There are grieving rituals that we're not able to do right now that make it harder for us to accept the reality of loss and also experience the pain of loss in a way that is healthy, right? So right now, if one of your friends has died and they're far away, you can kind of say to yourself, well, I don't see them because the pandemic's going on and I can't go to see them. That's what's going on. Whereas if you had been able to go to the funeral, you might be able to say, oh yeah, so-and-so's dead. For that matter, you're able to process pain differently if you're able to gather together a whole network of support, not simply virtually, but in person, in real life as well. So the third task, so again, the first task is accepting the reality of loss. The second one is experiencing and processing the pain of loss. So to grieve, you need to grieve. Then the third one is adjusting to the new world. So you start off with a loss of equilibrium, and you're going to be in that for a while. But you'll start to move to a spot where you are able to recognize and adjust to that loss. So it's adaptation or readaptation. Then finally, the fourth task that is the part of the grieving process is reinvesting emotional energy. So one of the things you need to do is go through the whole process. You need to end the conspiracy of silence. You can no longer pretend like that loss has not happened. Because when you've got there, you're then able to, okay, I've lost this person, this pattern, this thing, and now I can do a new thing. I can reinvest. And again, this might be a process that takes days, weeks, months, or years, because we all grieve differently. Different losses are larger or smaller. But we can then find a new enduring connection. So healthy new things to do and to be in relation, and people to be in relationship with. So, final question for you all, and this will take a while to think about, is what tasks do you need to do with your current grief work? So that's all I have for you. This is the first session. We'll be doing something like this every Thursday for 5 weeks. Blessings all, and be well, be safe.